to our third roundtable in this series, The Future of Engineering. A big thank you to our donors who have made this session possible. We have a great group of thought leaders here today, as you can see on your screen. They're going to share their insights and expertise with us on the future of funding in our new normal. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce two of my colleagues from the ACEC Research Institute, Joe Bates, who will serve as our moderator for today's session, and Kevin McMahon, who will be monitoring the chat box and fielding your questions during the session. Joe, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Daphne, and thank you all for joining us today. First, I'd like to introduce each of our panelists that we have with us. First, there's Rosemarie Andolino. Rosemarie is the former chairman of MAG USA and CEO of International Development for the Manchester Airport Group in the UK, where she oversaw the development of MAG's North American and global airport services business. She currently serves as an independent board member and advisor to various for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. And previously, she served as the commissioner of the Chicago Department of Aviation, where she oversaw the management and operations of one of the world's busiest airport systems, comprised of O'Hare and Midway International Airports. Rosemarie, welcome today. I'd also like to welcome Anirban Basu. Anirban is chairman and CEO of Sage Policy Group, an economic and policy consulting firm headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland, with an office in Indonesia. The firm provides strategic analytical services to energy suppliers, law firms, medical systems, government agencies, and real estate developers, among others. In 2014, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan appointed Anirban chair of the Maryland Economic Development Commission. He also serves as the chairman of the Baltimore County Economic Advisory Committee. Welcome, Anirban. Next, I'd like to introduce Jeff Davis. Jeff is a senior fellow with the Eno Center for Transportation and is also the editor of the Eno Transportation Weekly. Jeff has worked on Capitol Hill, working on various legislative, budget process, oversight, and parliamentary procedure issues. He also worked extensively on the FAA, Amtrak, and surface transportation reauthorization laws in the late 1990s. His current work focuses on analysis of the federal transportation budget, and his long-term trends in transportation, funding, and policy. Finally, I'd like to welcome David Zipper. David is a visiting fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Taubman Center for State and Local Government, where he examines the interplay between urban policy and new mobility technologies. David's perspectives are rooted in his experience working within City Hall, as well as being a venture capitalist, policy researcher, and startup advocate. He has consulted with numerous startups and public officials about regulatory strategy. So thank you all for joining us today, and welcome. I'd like to go ahead and get started and jump right in to get a sort of feel of what's going on with the economy. As everybody knows, the US economy, as well as the engineering profession, was hit quite hard by the pandemic. And the last business impact survey that ACEC conducted showed that over 80% of firms said they felt that the economy was in worse shape today than it was on March 1st before the pandemic really took hold. So clearly there's a lot of pain going on out there. There's a lot of stimulus efforts that have happened. But Anirban, I'd like to turn to you and ask you to give us an overview of what's happening with the economy right now and where you think it's going in the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, well, look, the recession is dated to have begun in February. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Cycle Dating Committee, I think by late April, it was over. In late April, that was the nadir for mobility of Americans based on cell phone and other data. Governor Kemp in Georgia started opening up the economy on April 20th, and there was a lot of cash that had been built up in the economy in the household sector because of those $1,200 checks plus $600 in federal subsidies for unemployment insurance benefits. So the household savings rate went from 8% pre-crisis to 33% by April. As the economy opens up in May, guess what? We get job growth, 2.7 million jobs added in May. We followed up in June, 4.8 million. That's not consistent with recession. And so it felt pretty good, didn't it? Retail sales surging 17.7% in May, then again bouncing back in June. Felt really good. And then what happens? Florida, it's always Florida for some reason. Florida, Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Governor of Oklahoma is now COVID-19 positive. So the surge in reinfections has put the entire economic recovery in doubt. And we can see that some of these reopenings have been postponed. Some of them have been reversed. We got the initial jobless claims today at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and they were somewhat disappointing. The market's down today. So I was looking forward to a third and fourth quarter that was very robust in terms of economic expansion. It might still happen because people don't seem to care that there is this viral spread. They're just going about their lives. I'm in Ocean City, Maryland today. No one out there on the beach is wearing a mask, I can tell you. And they're not social distancing. They're just going about life as if it's normal. You wouldn't know that there was a pandemic. So for right now, the economic outlook is very uncertain. I just think that the economic expansion will continue through the end of the year, but it won't be nearly as dramatic as I had hoped up until about a month ago.
How long do you think, Anirban, that the overhang will stay with us? You know, there's bound to be a vaccine in the early part of next year. I think pretty much everybody is banking on that right now. So let's say we get a vaccine, you know, things return back to normal in terms of how society functions sometime next year. What's the longer term outlook? Are we gonna, is this like 2009? Are we gonna be sort of suffering for a while, or do you think it's gonna be a lot shorter than that?
Oh no, I think it's gonna be longer than that. And I'll tell you why. You know, after 2009, you know, the economy sort of came back to life. You know, I mean, we pumped a lot of money into the economy. We recapitalized the banks. The Federal Reserve increased its balance sheet from $800 billion pre-crisis to $4.5 trillion during and after the crisis. So, you know, the money disappeared as the housing market collapsed. You know, that's what caused, you know, 2008, 2009. We put money back into the system, bam, lengthiest economic expansion in American history and very little inflation. Booming stock market. It was fabulous. And we entered with that momentum in January and February of 2020. You know, in February, we added more than 250,000 jobs. This time, what do we have? We have shattered government finances, state and local. We have a commercial real estate sector that is in deep recession and will take years to recover, right? Empty storefronts, shuttered restaurants, vacated office suites. And so that weakness lingers. We've got lots of debt on various balance sheets, household balance sheets, corporate balance sheets, and of course, governmental balance sheets, and especially the federal government, right? Which in June ran nearly a $900 billion deficit for 1 month. $864 billion. So you put all that together, I think it is possible to talk about a double dip recession. And in fact, it is conceivable that we'll have that double dip this year. If you agree with my proposition that we were in recession, we came out of recession, we could go back into recession this year. And then at some point in the future, once this next round of stimulus works its way through the economy, you can get another recession thereafter. So there's, a W and then another V on top of that. It's a really risky moment in economic history, and the policymakers have to get this right. And those are political outcomes they have to get right, and political outcomes are rarely right. So, I mean, that's where we are right now, a very uncertain place.
Great. Okay, Anirban, thank you for that perspective. I'd next like to focus on a question for Jeff. As some of you probably know who have looked at the ACEC business impact study that we conducted, 90% of firms reported obtaining a PPP loan to bridge the summer and spring trough that many expected. The question here is, will clients start new projects once we get through the summer, or are we going to continue to struggle through next year? Jeff, what do you think?
In terms of the regular federal infrastructure programs, the federal side of the spending hasn't been affected yet by any of this coronavirus. The question has always been the degree to which the level of the government that can print its own money, the federal government, is going to step in temporarily and assist the levels of government that can't print their own money, state and local. And so you saw a little bit, like $150 billion of aid to state and local governments was in the last tranche of coronavirus relief. The House passed its own wish list bill about a month ago, $3.5 trillion in one bill that was going to have, I think, $500 billion for state and local governments None of that set aside directly for state DOTs, but that's the fundamental question we've got to answer is, if you're going to provide aid to state and local governments, does the federal government single out transportation as being privileged and give it a special carve out of money and leave everything else up to state and local politicians to determine the priorities, or do they make transportation aid subject to state and local decisions and placing that, weighing it against the needs for education budgets, of corrections budgets, of all the other things that state and local governments do? There is zero consensus right now in Congress of whether state DOTs in particular should receive a special targeted round of assistance that's not subject to state and local governments determining where to best allocate the resources. The House, Senate Majority Leader McConnell is going to introduce his own coronavirus bill next week. They've got a July 31st deadline for hopefully leaving town, at least the House, for 5 weeks, and also unemployment insurance going to run out. So extended unemployment is going to be in that bill at some rate. We're not sure if the special $600 bonus will be in there or any kind of bonus at what level. McConnell wants to put at least $75 billion in dangling a carrot financial aid to school systems that open on time in late August, September. And the only other thing I know about that bill is that he's determined to keep the price tag below $1 trillion. So you have a House bill at $3.5 trillion. The Senate's going to try to max out at $1 trillion, and they're going to have between middle of next week and July 31st to figure out what that goes. So, because again, it doesn't do any good if the federal government is putting out money at 80% federal share for highways if the state or local state DOT can't afford its own 20% or is uncertain whether they're going to have the dedicated revenues over the next X number of months to cover their 20%. So that's the basic issue, is the uncertainty of government tax receipts at the state and local level is going to start hampering all this.
So if I can press you on this just a little bit, Jeff, and I'd also like to get David's thoughts on this. You're saying that the federal money is there. So are projects going to be affected? If so, in what way?
Cash going out the door for federal infrastructure programs has not really been affected at all yet by coronavirus. Okay. But for the big highway and transit programs, those are reimbursable dollars. The government signs a contract up front. Only after the federal government, the state government pays the contractor, do they come to the U.S. Department of Transportation and get reimbursed. So the dollars leaving the door in the Treasury is a lagging indicator. Unfortunately, it's the most up-to-date indicator we have as far as monthly basis. We'll find out next week, hopefully, on the obligations, the grant agreements actually signed between the federal government and state and local government for infrastructure. We'll hopefully have an updated quarterly total on that. And they're about to move to monthly reporting on that, so we can finally get something other than anecdotal evidence, from state DOT here or city transit agency there on how much they're curtailing their future spending plans in light of the coronavirus revenue uncertainty. But at the federal level, we don't quite have the data yet on the degree to which the federal government's local and state government infrastructure partners are rolling back activity, looking to the future yet.
Yeah, and can I follow on that?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, and just because I do a lot of work in particular with urban transportation, like the transit agencies, and I can sort of speak from that perspective. I mean, everything that Jeff is saying is I think true. And the lack of certainty, the lack of clarity at the federal level sort of filters down to transit agencies being very concerned, or cities being very concerned about future cash support, which leads them to make decisions now about future planning. And I can give a few examples of that. You can see that like very simply, but some of the groups that are hit the hardest by this right now would be the transit agencies that live off of their fare box revenue. They're using the fare box revenue from last week to pay their bills from this week. So just this week, there's been a big controversy in the Bay Area where Caltrain may or may not get the funding it would need through a special sales tax to be able to continue. And it's kind of incredible for as affluent an area as the Bay Area, serious conversation about Caltrain ceasing service. And if that happens, that actually, and I want to make this clear, since given the audience here, it's not like you can just turn off a transit agency and then turn it back on. You're losing mechanics, you're losing specialized knowledge about the technology, and the vehicles that is very difficult to emulate. And you look over New York with the MTA saying that they're going to have money to get through August. And the director was saying yesterday that she's being forced to go through the whole org chart to lay people off. And then sort of compounding these problems, you've got, especially in New York, for those who may be there, you've got the Trump administration sitting on decongestion pricing, which would have otherwise provided a $15 billion cash infusion into MTA at a time that really needs it. So there's plenty more examples I could cite, but I would simply say, you know, this is a time when on the urban transportation side, which I would imagine is of interest to many in the audience, you're seeing a lot of leaders being forced to assume the worst because there's just no clarity from the federal government about whether there would be a secondary infusion like there was with the CARES Act, which is forcing them to hunker down and make some really difficult decisions.
And at the state level, most states operate under constitutions or laws prohibiting them from running a deficit. So, and the deficits are cash in, cash out. So they've got to arrange their future spending commitments based on the latest anticipated future tax revenues. And that's why they have to particularly curtail slow spending capital programs early and upfront to try to make sure that they don't run a deficit 6 or 12 months down the line when the bills are coming due and being paid.
Rosemarie, I want to get you in the conversation here as well. How do you see, since we're talking about the public sector here and the public funding, how is the public funding going to affect the airlines, the airports? Obviously, the airlines got a little bit of assistance in the last month or so, maybe not as much as they wanted, but what's your take on the public funding and how that's going to affect the airline sector?
Well, I think you see two things, right? Not only did the airlines get some money, but airports did as well. Right now, I think everybody is in a cost constraining mode, right? No spending, looking at ways to actually conserve money and continue to projects that have been funded or continue moving along with things that have, make sense. But, long-term projects, new terminal developments, where if they haven't already, again, been funded, are going to be placed in a holding pattern right now due to the fact that we need to see where the world's going. We need to see what type of demand there will be. I think this aligns, however, with large capital projects needing time, right, to plan things out in order before construction. But what will the future look like? That's going to be the challenge that we face. And I think that's where we need to focus our time and energy right now, is looking at what are going to be the needed things that airports are going to need to put in place. If you think about 9/11 and what occurred after 9/11, TSA, we have all these check-in facilities now. You have the meter and greeter halls that now have all these security measures in place. And places like Chicago's airports, older facilities, most US airports weren't built to handle that type of impact in our terminal facilities. However, now what you see is going to be another layer of potential demands or needs of policy changes, which we won't even know for a while yet what's going to happen. So I think at the moment, airport directors, airlines are still trying to understand what is going to need to happen for the issue we're dealing with today, the pandemic we're dealing with today, but what then does the future bring? What do we have to plan for the next phase of the next what is? The one thing I will say about our industry is, the aviation sector has also always been an indicator in the economy, right? It kind of leads because of the fact that you have to book your travel in advance. You start seeing where the spending is going. You start seeing what the airlines are putting in place, where the demand is for the next 3 months, what's going to be happening in the fall. So this is going to be a time now where we're going to see the bookings of what's going to be booked by the carriers and what the demand's going to be, as cities are kind of hunkering down again, putting in more restrictions of travel. What's that next phase going to be, and what are those impacts going to be? And that's just phase one. We're not even into our fall phase 2 yet of what could happen. But on the positive note is the aviation industry has always recovered stronger than where it was before. So ideally, we could see these trends, and recovery happen quickly However, we're still out 3 to 5 years in that recovery. And what will come back first will be that domestic travel, right? The leisure travel, domestic travel. What's still on hold right now, which is kind of the bread and butter of the industry, is business travel. And that is a key importance to the success of the entire, not only aviation industry, but hospitality industry as well. We talked about, the entire economy at the opening of restaurants, et cetera. That all feeds from travel, aviation, and business.
So I want to ask a couple of follow-ups here, Rosemarie. You talked about the short term and then the long term. So let's break that down in terms of funding. How are the airports and the airlines going to do the things they need to do in the short term? Where are they going to get the money from for that?
Well, again, I think there's been some money that has been passed around recently. I think everybody's looking at what's going to be the next phase. Is there going to be another CARES Act 2, or is it going to be the HR 2 bill? Will there be provisions in that for airports? And again, there'll be another round of CARES Act funding, right? So those two things are going to be extremely important. I think right now, in terms of where they get the money, is again what they've already issued. So airports are reliant on GARBs, right? General Airport Revenue Backed Bonds that have already perhaps been issued for key projects, or AIP money that has come from the federal government. And airports are long term. They plan 3 and 5 years out. So projects have already been planned, designed. Perhaps they're going through the bidding stage now for construction, depending on what part of the world you're in. So that work is going to continue. What the question will be is major, terminal redevelopments, right? Major projects. When you have additional capacity right now in the market, the question really is, are you going to retrofit your facilities, use that money to retrofit your facilities to perhaps close down some concourses, to consolidate the operations? It's impacted everybody from the cleaning, people that are, the cleaning crews and cleaning these large facilities, to the operations of concessions. You talked about the airlines, the airports. There's so many jobs and activities that are part of aviation, so many behind the scenes that you don't realize that are, again, especially with key facilities like that, are huge. Cargo has continued, the demand for cargo, high value cargo. So a lot of retrofitting for those aircraft have been carrying cargo. Passenger carriers have been carrying cargo now more, even in not only in the belly of the plane, but they've converted, the passenger seating to carry cargo as well. So, that has been growing and has been stable. But in terms of getting revenue, collecting money from what the normal revenue creations would be, like, the passenger facility charge, the concessionaires, all of that has basically come to a halt. It's just trickling in. And so that's where the focus will be on O&M, right? In terms of the maintenance of your facilities. I think to take advantage, when I was at O'Hare, we were in a decline. It was the recession when we were building the $8 billion expansion program. And Kevin will remember this. Many airports were actually closing down their programs because of what was ahead. We were actually moving forward because the down in traffic gave us the ability to actually build those runways, the infrastructure that normally has to be, that's normally impacted with high volumes of operations, give you a little bit more flexibility in that construction of those major impacting projects. So for airports like Utah, who have said, we're going to continue to go forward, they're continuing to build their facilities to get it done, save money on delivering it faster, right? And build, it's in that stage of what it needs to be complete. But for most airports, it's really going to be functional improvements that they're going to be needing to make with the money they have, and reprioritizing perhaps fundings of projects already out to actually move that money to do functional improvements for current environment.
Okay, so it sounds like things are, for the moment, in the airport space, the projects are continuing, but the question is a bit more long-term in this
major change projects, I think, are just are going slower. It hasn't, completely unless it's like a hotel development or certain things of that nature, and depending on where the stage is and they are in their development. But if they're in the pre-construction, I think they're starting to go a little slower before they put the shovel in the ground in order to manage the future, right? Because this is a 3 to 5 year recovery. It takes usually 3 to 5 years to build some major projects.
Sure. Anirban, what are your thoughts about the airline industry in particular as you look at the sort of the macroeconomic movements here?
Oh, I think there'll be a rapid bounce back. You said it earlier, we're going to get a vaccine at some point, right? Come on, Pfizer, come on, Moderna, come on, Bayer AG, Regeneron, Gilead, somebody, start up your computer, get some test tubes out and do this, because that's what's going to solve this problem. That's the only thing that can do it. It's not going to be because of our good behavior and our mask wearing. We don't seem capable of that. And so you can see the pent-up demand out there. You can see that people want to travel, right? When Disney opens up, but I think the best example of this was when the Las Vegas casinos opened up and the long lines to try to get into those places. People want to live like that. They want to go to professional sports games. They want to do all of those things, and a lot of that requires travel. And so once we get a vaccine, and obviously people are talking about how long it'll take to get people actually vaccinated. It's not just discovering the vaccine, but actually operationalizing it. But once that happens, I think you'll see tremendous traffic increases at some point in 2021 itself. I really believe that. Business travel is going to come back. I love these Zoom meetings. I really like this. This is fun. But there's nothing like that coffee break after a long speech, getting ready for the next speech, and shaking the hands with sponsors and others. And so I think that comes back pretty quickly. I think it comes back more quickly than most economists would.
On Anirban, I think right now, if I could add, you touched on the fact of what's happening, right? This is the leisure market, right? These airlines are offering right now very discounted prices, discounted fares for travel. A lot of packages out there. You've got your choice, right? But the reality is you can't social distance on a plane, right? You can wear your masks, but there are some challenges associated with that. And where the risk is not being taken is in the business community, right? Business companies don't want to take that risk. And again, that's a key driver for the changes in the airline economy, is that business traveler.
If I could, I think
we need a vaccine.
Yes.
I think we all agree we need a vaccine. If I just connect actually the airport question with this issues about broader ones about transportation projects, I think a glimmer of hope for the airlines, although not for transit, is that for the foreseeable future, people are not comfortable taking transit. Ridership is down around 50%, and ride-hail trips are way down too. So what that suggests to a lot of people, myself included, is that one source of revenue for airports, meaning parking facilities, may get a bit of a boost, which is something that has not been the way it's been going for a while. You disagree with that?
Yeah, parking facilities have been consolidated again. There's no demand for parking right now. There's excess, there's plenty of supply in terms of parking, close proximity to your terminal if you're departing at the moment. So parking at airports is challenging. I mean, look at the rental car industry as well. You've seen Hertz in bankruptcy.
Oh, sure.
You're going to see consolidation there.
Yeah, there's no question of that. I guess for the next year, though, I think I would expect, if I had to make a bet, I would put more money on parking revenue for airports to come back faster than transit ridership.
And over the next month, the next year or so, the data we have indicates that the best performing infrastructure site is going to be hot lanes, because what's going to be slowest to come back to get a vaccine is carpooling. Particularly with the DC area and a couple other places had a thing called slug lining, where complete strangers would line up in certain places in the suburbs to be picked up by other complete strangers and share their air in their car for 15 minutes so to go downtown to be able to use the express lanes. That's going to be the last thing that comes back in all of transportation. And so hot
I would agree with you.
Hot lanes where you can pay extra money to use the carpool lane, if you think ticket in there is important, or if the lanes are being congestion managed at all times, like the new I-66 is here. What we've seen, Transurban reported that the lanes they run in China, and there are a bunch of them, now actually have more ridership as of a month ago than they did before coronavirus. So at least in the time being, not long term, but until we get a vaccine, single occupancy ridership and the toll lanes that make revenue directly from people who are willing to pay are may even do better in the interim than we're doing before coronavirus.
So now, Jeff, that's assuming that we have traffic congestion like we had previously, right? If people aren't going into the office, then maybe we're not going to have the same level of congestions. I don't know. What do you think about that?
That's true. Again, I anticipate sort of slow quasi reopenings, and again, I forget how widely they're spread out. So the places that went to terminal a kind of congestion pricing anyway, like Interstate 66 in Northern Virginia is now tolled all morning at those congestion-based tolls that are set by computer, where that the toll varies minute to minute to trying to keep traffic at 45 miles an hour, whatever I think it is. So things like that. Unfortunately, if a vaccine takes 2 years, there has to be significantly more reopening than we have in urban cores to get through 2 years. You can't have 2 years of shutdown. So to the extent there's going to be some kind of reopening, vaccine or not, single occupancy cars or cars occupied by immediate family members only are going to be where it's at in that short term. And then it's a question of, once we do get a vaccine, of digging out of those habits and trying to get back to the changes in using different modes that we were trying to get to before coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to go back and talk just a little bit more about the public sector, and before we turn to the private sector in terms of projects. And Anirban, I want to direct this one to you. How are the states and localities going to make up for the revenue shortfalls they're seeing? You know, the tax revenues are way down. People aren't spending as much. How are they going to survive and continue to fund their portion of these public projects?
I mean, there's only one way, isn't that right? They have to have assistance from the federal government. I mean, that's it. I mean, it had been pointed out by Jeff, I believe state and local governments have to balance their budget every year, but the federal government doesn't. And the federal government right now is looking at a 10-year treasury yield of 0.615%. This is actually a really good time for the federal government to borrow. Oh, I know. The national debt is $26.5 trillion. I get that. At some point, we have to start paying some of that back. I understand that, but we're in the midst of a pandemic, a crisis. And state and local governments have already laid off 1.5 million workers in recent months. If that continues, then that will really stifle the economic recovery we all want for this country. And so that's it. I mean, how else are you going to make up billions and billions of dollars of lost revenue? If you try to increase taxes, if you're New York or Connecticut or New Jersey, guess what happens? People move to Florida. You know, so there's a limit to what you can do in terms of revenue enhancement. Now you can, toll more roads and so on and so forth. There's some of that. There's less elasticity there. So customers still have to use those roads to get to wherever they're going. And so maybe that makes sense. But otherwise, it's really the federal government. And that, I think you're going to see this month, is some kind of stimulus package with monies for state and local governments. That's going to help a lot on the capital side and on the operating side.
Okay, David, anything else to add on that subject?
Yeah, I mean, in the absence of federal funding, the only other options I see would be new tax revenue at the local level. And Anirban's right that there's a cap to what you can do there. And as we saw in San Francisco earlier this week, even there, in a particularly affluent city, they didn't want to do a very small sales tax raise to fund Caltrain. So what you end up with and this is, I was just talking to a transit CEO recently who's looking to push out the purchase of a bunch of electric buses for a couple of years. And there was a $15 billion program up in Boston to convert commuter rail to be regional rail with 15-minute headways and being all electric. That's now a little bit on ice, although they won't say that explicitly. I mean, this stuff is just going to get postponed unless there's an infusion of federal dollars. Because I tend to agree with Anirban that there might be bits and pieces of additional revenue you could get at the state and local level through tax raises, but it's not anything close to enough.
Okay. I want to take a second to remind the audience that we do have the Q&A chat for questions, and also the chat box. At the moment, we don't have any questions. Kevin. Okay, go ahead, Kevin.
Joe, we just got one.
Great.
And the question is, the panel's painted a very good picture of demand in aviation and transit, particularly being down short term. Major infrastructure clients are feeling the uncertainty of commitment from the federal government on funding. What would you advise most of our listeners who are running engineering firms in terms of their employee base? Should they be looking to, really be frugal in terms of hiring plans over the next year? Or do you see any type of demand that would encourage folks to go out and hire additional people?
Who wants to take that one?
So, well, I'd like, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead,
well,
Evan.
no, I was going to say, I've been saying to, whether you're an engineering firm CEO or whatever company it happens to be, what are we in right now? We're in cash preservation mode. That's it. We're trying to hold on to liquidity. I mean, that's it. We're trying to make payroll. Now, the other part of this is there will be an economic recovery. There was after 2008, 2009. There will be this time around. And so who do you want to be with you as that recovery begins? You want the best and the brightest engineers. You want your star salespeople, your star engineers, whoever you really need to be part of the team. And so that, you go down, person by person on your team and ask the question, do I need this person? And it's an unfortunate situation. We don't want to throw people out of work. That's not what this is about. But at the end of the day, if your enterprise doesn't survive, you're no good to anybody, including yourself. And so I think that's the mode we're in right now. There's just too much uncertainty to be in any other mode.
The goal of the federal aid right now is and should be trying to hold things level, to trying to keep the total amount of federal, state, and local money going for infrastructure type projects to be the same as it was going to be had coronavirus not happened. And then you've got a separate question of the great infrastructure backlog. But I think that's going to have to go on the back burner shortly in terms of just trying to maintain temporary directed aid, whether it's to revenue replacement, state and local governments or whatever, trying to tread water until coronavirus is over. And then next year, trying to do some kind of broader infrastructure boost above the current spending levels that state and local governments are now struggling to maintain. So it turns out it was a bad time to bring up infrastructure bills this year because the focus is much more on preserving the funding that we've already got going at the state and local level versus trying to build significant new dollar amounts of new capacity above that, which I think is going to have to wait till next year.
Rosemarie, were you wanting to add something to that?
I was going to add on to what Anirban said was the fact that, do you have the right people is really the question, because I think, again, as airports look to the future, airlines are looking to what is going to be necessary to make their customers feel safe and to continue to facilitate travel. What are the things that that are going to be needed at airports? And I think we need to look to engineers and others to help us understand what types of technologies, right? Whether it's cleaning and sanitation, if it's technology for contactless opportunities to service customers better in a contactless way, what are the types of things that need to be brought into place, again, to create functional enhancements of the facility today for better service that customers can rely on and feel, again, give them the comfort and safety for their travel journey. So I think, and for the future. So I think that is a key important component. I think also part of what's been discussed in Congress as well, and Jeff, you could probably add more to this, but the Congress is looking that if we are going to make investments, we want those investments then to put our infrastructure in a better place, right? To make it better than it was. Many airports are older facilities and are retrofitted. How do you take those facilities that you have today and whatever investments you make it so that they're better for the future, sustainable, green, less energy in terms of technology. Those, I think, are some of the things that can be worked on now. And again, do you have to UV light, baggage as it's going through baggage systems? What is going to be the future? And I think getting the bright, engineering groups that are out there, the people, the right talent to help think these things through and come up with solutions and ideas are going to be extremely important. Again, how do you minimize costs and investment, but come up with great solutions?
Kevin, it looks like we've got some more questions in there.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. There's a couple questions. One I'll ask the panel right now is, conventionally, infrastructure has been seen as a great type of stimulus funding mechanism to get people back to work, seems like nowadays more of the stimulus is funding is on just giving laid off employees cash versus creating jobs. Isn't this the perfect environment to create a infrastructure bill that would think big and get people back to work? Why is that not as robust in the discussion as some of our panelists, some of our listeners think it should be?
Jeff, do you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah. Well, first of all, your aid needs to be targeted to what your problem is. And immediately, as of June 30th, the number of people employed in heavy and civil engineering construction, seasonally adjusted, was down 8% from February, the pre-coronavirus peak. And again, seasonally adjusted is pivotally important in outdoor activities like construction. But that 8% is 85,000 jobs. I'm not sure that should be the prime focus of federal recovery when you've got 5 million people out of work just in the hospitality and restaurant sectors alone. Not to mention, the million or so state and local government employees, 400,000 people in transportation providing sectors, whatever. The infrastructure, every day of automation and complication means that infrastructure spending as a way of providing jobs as stimulus is a little less effective than it was back in the good old days. So even though, we definitely as a country need to be spending more money on infrastructure, focusing on infrastructure as a job creator is probably not the right answer when the majority of job losses are not from people who are probably going to want to retrain to go work in construction.
You know what though, Jeff, I think on top of that though is the benefit of, with low traffic, right, with low utilization of our infrastructure today because people are staying at home still, to again, minimize impacts, right? Greenhouse gas impacts, minimize congestion impacts, all of the things that also come when you can actually do more with a, kind of a respite here where there aren't as many constraints on your current infrastructure. It's easier to close down lanes and to build more. The challenges we have, let's say the Myrtle Beach corridor, I know the congressman there had been struggling many, many years because it's a definite destination for the drive market. But the roads there are built for the local traffic, not to handle the ingress and egress of the swells of people that come and drive into the marketplace. So it causes major congestion for those living there and for the community at large. To make those investments today while traffic is low, it will be a win-win for, again, when that curve starts, that curve starts rocketing up again, to be able to accommodate them efficiently and to grow the market. Because with the delays that they're experiencing last year, they're going to start to lose, they would have start losing traffic. So if we could fix a tenth of the problem today so that we're prepared for that future growth again, would be ideal. And if it creates jobs and feeds families, that's a bonus.
Yeah, there's a variety of transit agencies that are doing the exact same thing of trying to do the capital investments on an expedited timeline now to take advantage of the fact that few people are riding. Same thing goes if few people are using a bridge, easier time to do repairs. It's less disruptive. And that will provide some efficiency gains. The problem though is that capital budgets are different from operating budgets, certainly for transit agencies and for everybody else. And it's the fare box revenue that's gone down 50% plus in many places. It's coming back very slowly, and there simply isn't enough money to keep to keep the lights on effectively. That's where I worry. Although I think all the points Jeff made about recognizing that transportation is part of a much larger economy, which is where other parts have been hit even harder, is a worthwhile thing to keep in mind so that we can maintain perspective.
Kevin, do you want to ask any other questions before we move on to the private sector?
Yeah, I'll just ask one question, Joe.
Okay.
And it relates to, really there's a few questions I'll try to collapse into one. Relates to, is there any chance that Congress will do anything before the election and, like suspend NEPA for the next 6 months or anything like that? Or are we sort of in a really hold and defend mode until this election plays out?
I don't think legally they can suspend NEPA. Anything they did calling it an emergency would be instantly drawn out in court. But the Trump administration just yesterday released the final regulation on reforming all of the NEPA, on amending all the NEPA regulations comprehensively for the first time since they were issued in 1978, and putting hard 2-year time limits on a lot of these processes. So like I said, the regulation was released yesterday. It should be officially printed in the Federal Register in the next couple of days and take effect 60 days after that. I'm sure the environmentalists are going to sue, but that was the culmination of the entire Trump administration NEPA regulatory agenda for the last 4 years as it came about yesterday. So I'm not sure how much they're going to be able to do in addition to that between now and the end of the year.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the topic of the private funding on private projects. You know, this is sort of a whole other animal here. What's going to happen with, you know, apartment building, home building, a high-rise construction? Are we going to see a credit crunch? And, you know, I saw a piece of information this morning that said home builder sentiment is back to pre-coronavirus levels, which really surprised me. So, David, what do you think is going to happen here in the private sector?
Well, people still need places to live. I'm not sure how much they're going to need places to work in the same way as we did before. So, you know, I think I would look for a resurgence coming from the residential side faster than I would expect to see it on the office development side, particularly in the dense cities like where I'm based in Washington, D.C., where I've already heard murmurings about possible conversions from corporate into residential. I think that's going to take some time to play out, but I would have every expectation that residential would come back before commercial. And then there's the next question of where. Is it going to be in a central city? Is it going to be in the suburban? Is this the big moment for some of the like second tier cities like Denver and Boise and Salt Lake City to suddenly suck some of the talent away from the big, expensive coastal megalopolises? I tend to be a little skeptical of that for a variety of reasons. But I will note, just to say that there is something happening, that the rents in San Francisco year over year are down over 12%, which is higher than any other market. So that does suggest that at least, and by the way, San Francisco has the highest rents, those who don't know, in the whole country. So it does suggest there is some movement now, at least temporarily, of people who can move and go live with family or just relocate for a while, that they are. I think, and this is, I think it's a bit of a shaky time for a market like the Bay Area. But you know, I always, my attitude is always, it's easy to overestimate the duration and extent of a change when you're in the middle of it. So I wouldn't quite, if I had the chance, I wouldn't sell off all my my buildings in Manhattan just yet. Let's put it that way.
And Anirban, what are we looking at in terms of a credit crunch? Do we have anything to worry about there? Is the Fed providing sufficient liquidity in the markets, and are the private projects going to have problems getting funded?
Oh, I think the credit crunch has already begun. Federal Reserve can create as much money supply as it wants. It can't force banks to lend. And there's nothing bankers like less than defaults and delinquencies. They hate it. It ends careers. And it destroys quarterly financials. So, yeah, it's already begun. And, you know, with respect to, you know, some of the comments David was making, very good comments. I think this is the decade of the suburbs. The previous decade was the decade of the cities. Millennials turn into their 20s in large numbers, often renting very expensive apartments, driving density. But, and this was going to be the decade of the suburbs even without COVID-19, but COVID-19 makes it even more so. So owner-occupied part of the residential market is flying high. Homes are flying off the shelves. Condos are selling freely in all markets, even in Connecticut. But I'll tell you that multifamily market will be much more challenging going forward. You're going to see a real surge in vacancy rates in multifamily America going forward. And of course, that's going to further perpetuate that credit crunch. And then commercial real estate, forget about it. It's already in crisis and will be in crisis for many years to come because, again, of all those empty office suites, abandoned storefronts, shuttered restaurants, so on and so forth. So the suburbs will fare better than the cities, but commercial real estate generally will be in quite bad shape.
Rosemarie, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Well, again, living in an urban environment in Chicago, I would agree that you're starting to see, somebody joked about people moving to Florida, right? There's been a huge influx of people relocating. And I think you're seeing that from a lot of major cities. I mean, people, whether it was the COVID that hit New York and Chicago and other locations, and people then relocating to what they thought were communities that were less exposed or had things under control, which is now basically inverted, right? So now those communities are challenged. But you've got distance, you've got, more, again, you're not as, crunched in together, right? And as in an urban environment, you have some more freedom. So to actually, be outside and have space away from people. So I think there's definitely that exodus happening. And, with the change of offices and, some of the leading technology companies, right, that are out there are saying, don't come back. We don't need you to come back to the office for a couple, let's revisit it in a year or 2 years. So if that's where most of the key employment was, and if they can all work from home, will they be buying then a nicer, more expansive home and spending their money there if they're not moving around the country as much either in travel?
If I could, it was an interesting thing that just happened. I think it was today, if not today, yesterday. Airbnb, which I think is a really interesting company in the midst of all this, just announced that they're back to doing an IPO. And what's interesting is they got hammered hard. They had to raise a down round of capital because when the coronavirus hit, people did the whole one night or 2 night business just disappeared. But now they've created this whole new market, and the CEO, Brian Chesky, talks about this, of month to 2 month rentals, where people are going into a cabin here, there, what have you. And it's true that some of the largest employers in the country, some of the tech companies in particular, have said we're not going to require people to be back throughout 2020. It opens the door, and Airbnb's really fast recovery with this creation of a new long-term rental market, which, by the way, is driven not by urban locations, does lead to the question, and I think anyone who goes beyond asking the question is saying they know more than they really do, of whether some people are going to decide, you know what, for the foreseeable future, I really don't need to live in a central city with my family anymore. How that plays out, I don't know, but it's interesting to watch.
Well, and if I can add to that, I think what the additional factor is going to be in the next few weeks, it's really going to show its head, is if school districts are not going to require kids to actually go to school,
that's a good point.
Then parents can relocate anywhere and spend the next 3 months, 6 months, as you said, in different cities, or different communities, because they can learn from anywhere. They can work from anywhere, and the children can learn from anywhere. So that's, I think, is going to be a key factor coming up that hasn't actually shown itself yet.
Kevin, do we have any questions on the private sector side of things?
Yeah, there's one quick comment. One of our Connecticut participants, Anirban, really liked your comment about, wow, when people are moving to Connecticut, it's shocking. So you got some airtime on that. But Joe, the question is about some private, some public ports and inland waterways. Is that really just dependent on the economy and freight movement, or what does the panel think about that space?
Who'd like to take that one?
I think the cruise industry in terms of passenger cruises is challenged right now. So I think in terms of ports, for the purpose of the hospitality industry, the travel industry, that's a longer term recovery than even aviation, so you're looking more from, 4 to 7 years. It's just, how are they going to deal with those issues?
The big $1 trillion infrastructure bill the House passed on July 2nd didn't really deal with ports and inland waterways and harbors that much, because the bill that passed the House was a Democratic-only messaging exercise, and they were very close to a bipartisan 2-year reauthorization bill for those programs that passed committee in the House yesterday. It's passed committee in the Senate a month ago, and it's one of the few things that actually make it enacted into law on its own before the end of the year. And in addition to authorizing a few new large projects, they're also trying desperately. They finally found a budget gimmick in the House that'll work to unlock that $9.5 billion that's been collected over 30 years in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and not spent. So that may get enacted into law this year, finally, separate from any other infrastructure package. which would really open the floodgates on a lot of much needed harbor dredging capacity improvements, et cetera.
So we only have a few minutes left here, so I'd like to ask each of you to peer into your crystal ball. This is my final question, which I like asking on these roundtables. And the question is, I'm going to start with you, Anirban. One, it's a two-part question. One, and you've gotten into this a little already, but how long will this recovery take for us to reach levels that were pre-COVID? And not only how long will it take, but what's the critical thing that has to happen for the recovery to proceed?
Oh, it'll take years to fully recover from this. I mean, I think the initial period of recovery has been sharp, will be sharp going forward, even with some of these reopenings being postponed and some of them even being reversed. But it's going to take years. I mean, if I ask you the question, back to you, how long did it take us to get to a 50-year low in unemployment? It took us 50 years. I mean, the economy was really shockingly good coming into this pre-crisis period. And we entered, as I say, 2020 with so much momentum. It's going to take a long time to put that back together again. And we in America, what's it going to take to really get back? Bipartisanship, right? The radical center reemerging so we can work together so that something like a Tip O'Neill and Ron Reagan on a Friday afternoon going to a Georgetown pub to talk policy, that could happen again in this country. And that's what's going to take, because we have unsettled immigration policy, we have unsettled infrastructure policy, we have global trade fragmenting and uncertain trade policy. And by the way, that relates to the ports outlook as well, as it turns out. You put all that together, that's what we're going to need, bipartisanship.
Okay, Rosemarie, what about you? How long will this recovery take, and what's the critical piece to proceeding?
Well, I believe we're right now. I think when this all hit, I should say we were at like the 1954 levels of traffic, in terms of aviation and travel. After 9/11, we saw a 30% decline in travel, but it was one region, right? Here, this is global. And in April, we saw an 80% decline. And what really was moving was those that had to move, whether it was medical professionals needing to move locations. You're seeing that come back with some leisure travel. But I think, again, the business community is going to be key, because that is the higher spend that the airlines and others need. And that is really the bigger indicator. I think you're looking at, 2022, really, before you'll see kind of the comeback here, because I think we're at least a year out from a vaccine, because again, we talked about that. That's going to be key for people to feel comfortable and safe. The one thing we have in the United States is short haul traffic and domestic traffic, right? So you can travel essentially within the 50 states with less restrictions. So I think people, whether they travel by car, but by air, they'll feel comfortable getting on the flight for an hour with their masks and, better cleanliness activities that have occurred on aircraft now. So you're going to continue to see that. Consolidation, I think, will happen. Fares will probably then, start going up in that regard. But international traffic, we're still looking at probably 2024 before that really comes back. So, it's gonna be a while. Ideally, the industry itself, there are things that need to be done, right, to make travel better for everyone, whether it be the passenger or the airlines or the airports, whether it's funding. We talked about NEPA and, constructability of programs, et cetera, and implementation. So I would hope that during this time, Congress can take that and the leadership can come together from the different organizations to actually solve those solutions, so that when traffic does come back, when we are earnestly building, newer programs, bigger projects, building the terminals of the future for our airports that have, not had those investments in many, many years, that we're able to do those with great technology, with simplified processes and proper funding, so that they can continue to be the economic engines that they have been for communities across the country.
Great. David, you next, and we'll close it out with Jeff.
Sure. I find this question, it would be a lot easier for me to answer if we were talking about Canada or about Holland, because there you're talking about basically like the V, I think, which is like you basically have the virus come, you put some cash in people's pockets to make the economy put it in a coma, basically, and then you come back out. And if we're talking about those countries, you can see that already, and this point was made earlier, that auto traffic is back up, and it's already higher than like the peak rush hour auto traffic is higher than it was before the virus in places like Guangzhou, over in China, and Shenzhen. But we frankly blew our chance to do that in this country. And you know, and I'm actually worried about how bad. I think things could actually get much worse in the next few months as people start losing their homes, being foreclosed on, as unemployment benefits run out. I don't think we realize that we are on the precipice of things getting a lot worse, with a lot of people in the middle class or lower middle class being unable to just survive. And who knows what that's going to do. That actually leads to political questions that go far beyond you know, the demand for certain types of engineering services. But I will say that it's going to take a long time before we need a vaccine. And even with a vaccine, I think it's going to take a long time in the United States to see a rebound in critical parts of the economy, especially for engineers, such as office construction. I think we're a long way away from that. I think we're a long way away from it with regards to urban transportation. And to be honest, like the most important thing to do now, in my view, is, to be honest, to call your elected representatives and tell them we absolutely need more stimulus money in people's pockets now. That's my personal view.
Great. Thanks, David. And Jeff, what about you? And then after your comments, Jeff, we're going to go to Daphne to close us out here.
Okay. In terms of additional federal dollars for new infrastructure, you know, new projects, new structures, new routes, I don't expect any action on that this year because Democrats, particularly in the House, and Republicans they're light years apart on the relative priorities they believe should be given to highways versus transit and mass transit and Amtrak, you know, the whole rural-urban divide. And every day that gets closer to the election with the polls where they are, Democrats saying, why would I bother negotiating issues that fundamental with the Republican Senate and the Republican president when there's a 50-50-ish or plus chance that starting in January, the Democrats can hold the trifecta and write a bill they really want instead of locking compromise priorities in for 5 or 6 years. Next year is what it's all going to be about. You know, the extensive infrastructure will be one of many priorities in addition to coronavirus. It's all going to get wrapped up in the fact that starting August 1st of next year, the statutory debt limit will reset. And they'll start taking emergency measures. We already added 4.6 trillion, I think, since the last reset, August 1st, just a year ago. So this will be by far the largest debt limit increase in the history of the country. And so September, October next year, Treasury won't be able to move money around. And traditionally, many of your major turning points in federal fiscal policy of the last 30 years, Graham-Rudman, the 1990-93 budget deals, Budget Control Act, TARP, Fannie-Freddie bailout, the last 2 budget deals, they all revolved around a debt ceiling crisis of trying to find ways to get the votes to raise the debt limit, and all the fiscal policy for that year wound up getting wrapped up in it. So I expect that to be the centerpiece of next year around September, October 2021 that will set the stage for fiscal policy for the next 5 to 10 years.
Got it. Yeah, well, let's all keep our fingers crossed that we have a vaccine by then, so at least we can take that out of the equation. Thank you all to the panelists for joining us. And Daphne, why don't you go ahead and close us out?
Great, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists and our donors for making this session possible. We have a short evaluation that we'll send you this afternoon, so please share your experience with us. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, and please stay safe.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, thank you.